The soldier known as Robert Shurtleff didn't exist. What his comrades saw was a well-fitted uniform, a practiced gait, a stoic silence they mistook for male bravado. But it was all a wall built to conceal a single truth. A simple medical examination would destroy everything. The courage they admired was, in fact, terror. Not terror of an enemy's bayonet, but terror of a friendly surgeon's tent. The proof? When a British musket ball lodged deep in his thigh, this soldier didn't call for a medic. He dragged himself into the woods, pulled out a penknife, and dug the lead from his own flesh. He would rather bleed to death from self-surgery than be discovered. The name Robert Shurtleff was a desperate wager. It was the bet a poor outcast girl named Deborah Sampson made to buy the one thing her society would never give her: freedom. Today, we are not talking about a soldier. We are talking about an impossible deception. And the question is, was that lie worth the price of blood, profound loneliness, and a painful secret she would carry to her grave? This was the world Deborah had chosen, and the reality of it was immediate and unforgiving. The first challenge was simply to exist as a man among men. It wasn't just about wearing the clothes. It was about inhabiting a new persona, 24 hours a day, with no breaks, no moments of respite. Her years of farm labor had given her a physical strength and stamina that matched and sometimes exceeded that of the other recruits. She could march for miles with a heavy pack and musket, dig trenches, and perform the endless drills under a blazing sun without complaint. Her physical resilience was her first and best line of defense against suspicion. But the physical demands were, in many ways, the easiest part. The true test was in the small, intimate moments of a soldier's life, moments that were fraught with the peril of discovery. Sleep was a communal affair, with soldiers packed tightly together in tents or crude barracks, their bodies nearly touching. There was no privacy. She learned to sleep on her back, arms crossed over her chest, a silent guard against any accidental touch that might reveal her secret. Bathing was an even greater challenge. Soldiers, when they had the chance, would often swim and bathe together in nearby rivers or streams. It was a moment of release and camaraderie for them, but for Deborah, it was a source of pure terror. She developed a series of clever excuses. She claimed a deep-seated fear of cold water, a story that might have earned her a few jeers, but was ultimately accepted. She would wait until the dead of night, or find a secluded spot far from the camp, to wash herself, always with one ear listening for approaching footsteps. Every rustle of leaves, every snapped twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. Even the simple act of relieving herself required constant vigilance and planning. She had to venture far from the common latrines, seeking the cover of woods or darkness, always risking being seen as strange or antisocial. Her fellow soldiers, a rough and ready bunch, nicknamed her Molly, a common moniker for young, clean-shaven recruits who hadn't yet developed the grizzled look of a veteran. The irony was almost certainly lost on them, but for Deborah, it must have been a constant, chilling reminder of the identity she was so desperately trying to conceal. Despite the constant, gnawing anxiety, she proved to be an exemplary soldier. She was diligent, followed orders without question, and maintained her equipment meticulously. She was a quiet but reliable presence, earning the respect of her comrades, not through boisterous talk, but through her steady competence. She listened to their stories of sweethearts and families back home, sharing a bond forged in shared hardship, all while harboring a secret that would have shattered that bond in an instant. She was a part of their world, yet utterly alone within it. After a period of training at West Point, the 4th Massachusetts Regiment was moved south. into the neutral ground of Westchester County, a volatile and dangerous strip of land between the main British forces in New York City and the American lines further north. This was not a land of grand, orderly battles. It was a place of brutal, irregular warfare. Skirmishes, ambushes, and raids were the daily bread of the soldiers stationed there. The enemy wasn't always a uniformed redcoat. It was often a loyalist partisan, a cowboy, or a skinner who knew the terrain intimately and fought with a particular viciousness. It was here, in the heat of this guerrilla-style conflict, that Private Robert Shurtleff first faced the true test of a soldier, the terror and chaos of combat. In June of 1782, just a month after her enlistment, her company was involved in a fierce skirmish near Tarrytown. The fighting was close and brutal, a whirlwind of musket fire, smoke, and the clash of steel. During the chaotic engagement, she suffered her first wounds. A glancing blow from a sword left a deep gash on the side of her head. Moments later, as she raised her musket to fire, the story is also told that 2 musket balls ripped through the thick fabric of her coat, but miraculously they only grazed her, causing minor contusions without breaking the skin. The battle ended, and the wounded were gathered. The surgeon began to tend to the men. Deborah felt the warm trickle of blood matting her hair and knew she was in mortal danger. A medical examination, however cursory, would mean immediate discovery. As the surgeon approached her, she waved him away, insisting she was fine. Adrenaline coursed through her veins, masking the pain. She claimed the head wound was nothing more than a scratch, a story made believable by the chaos of the moment. She allowed a fellow soldier to bind it crudely with a strip of cloth and refused any further treatment, retreating to the solitude of her tent to tend to it herself, her heart pounding with the narrowness of her escape. This incident was a stark lesson in the deadly gamble she was taking. It wasn't just enemy bullets she had to fear, but the helping hand of her own side. Her survival depended not just on her strength and courage in battle, but on her ability to suffer in silence and solitude. That ability would be tested to its absolute limit just a few weeks later, on a hot July day. Her unit was again on patrol near Tarrytown when they were ambushed by a larger force of Loyalist dragoons. The fighting was intense and desperate. The Americans were outnumbered and forced into a fighting retreat. In the chaos, as Deborah aimed her musket from behind a stone wall, a searing, white-hot pain exploded in her left thigh. She crumpled to the ground, the world dissolving into a haze of smoke and agony. She had been shot. A musket ball had torn through the flesh and lodged deep in her groin. As fellow soldiers rushed to help her, a second musket ball struck, hitting her in the shoulder. The pain was blinding, but through it, one terrifying thought screamed in her mind: the surgeon's tent. She knew, with absolute certainty, that if she were carried there, her secret would be over. The consequences were unthinkable: disgrace, punishment, being sent back to the life she had risked everything to escape. With a surge of desperate strength born of pure terror, she pleaded with her comrades to leave her. "Leave me to die," she begged. "Don't take me to the surgeon." Her fellow soldiers, seeing what they thought was the selfless act of a brave young man not wanting to endanger them, were hesitant. But she was adamant, propping herself up against a tree and continuing to fire her musket until they were forced to fall back, leaving her for dead as she had wished. When the sounds of battle faded, she was alone. The silence was punctuated only by her own ragged breaths and the groans of other wounded men scattered nearby. The pain in her thigh was an all-consuming fire. She knew she had to get out of there, but more importantly, she had to get the bullet out. Using her musket as a crutch, she dragged herself away from the battlefield, deeper into the woods, seeking a place where she could be completely alone. She found a small hidden clearing by a stream. The hours that followed were a testament to a level of courage and fortitude that is almost impossible to comprehend. Gritting her teeth against waves of nausea and pain that threatened to overwhelm her, she took out her penknife and probed the wound in her shoulder. Miraculously, that ball had not penetrated deeply, and she managed to extract it with relative ease. The wound in her thigh was another matter entirely. It was deep, and the bullet was lodged firmly in the muscle. The location was perilously close to major arteries, and to make matters worse, it was in a place that made any self-treatment incredibly difficult and intimate. There, in the fading light of a summer evening, surrounded by the indifferent sounds of the forest, Deborah Sampson performed surgery on herself. She sterilized the tip of her penknife and a sewing needle in the stream's cool water. Biting down on a piece of leather to keep from screaming, she began to cut into her own flesh, probing for the lead ball. The pain was excruciating, a raw, primal agony that would have broken most people. Her hands, slick with her own blood, trembled uncontrollably. But the fear of discovery was a greater motivator than the pain was a deterrent. After what must have felt like an eternity of agonizing exploration, her knife finally scraped against the hard metal of the musket ball. Using the knife and the needle as crude surgical tools, she managed to pry it loose and pull it from her own body. She collapsed, weak from blood loss and pain, but triumphant. She had preserved her secret. She cleaned the wound as best she could with water and cloth, and then, under the cover of darkness, she began the slow, agonizing journey back to the American lines. She limped into camp, claiming she had been separated during the retreat and had received first aid from a passing civilian. Her story, combined with her known stoicism, was accepted, but she had not been entirely successful. There had been 2 balls in her thigh. In her pain-ridden and desperate state, she had only managed to remove 1. The second musket ball remained lodged in her leg, a piece of British lead she would carry with her for the rest of her life, a constant, painful souvenir of the day she chose agonizing self-mutilation over the exposure of her true self. The wound healed poorly, and it would cause her to limp and be in chronic pain for the remainder of her days. Yet she soldiered on, her secret still safe, locked away behind a wall of incredible endurance. Life for Private Robert Shurtleff after the skirmish at Tarrytown was a new kind of hell. The musket ball she had extracted from her shoulder left a clean, healing scar, a badge of honor she could bear without fear. But the one that remained deep in her thigh was a constant, throbbing betrayer. The wound, improperly cleaned and never properly stitched, refused to heal. It festered, weeping fluid and sending shooting pains down her leg with every step. Back in the crowded, unhygienic conditions of the army camp, hiding such an injury was a monumental task. She learned to change her own crude dressings in the dead of night, stifling gasps of pain as she cleaned the suppurating wound. The foul smell of infection was a constant worry. She used what little money she had to buy ointments and strong-smelling herbs to try and mask it. Her limp, at first subtle, became more pronounced. She blamed it on a bad sprain or a twisted knee from the retreat, an excuse that held for a while among men who were all nursing their own collection of aches and pains. The winter of 1782 to 1783 was particularly harsh. The cold seeped into her bones, making the ache in her leg unbearable. There were nights she lay shivering in her thin blanket, convinced the infection would spread and kill her, or that the pain would become so great she would betray herself in a moment of delirium. The psychological strain was immense. She was surrounded by comrades, yet she was an island of secret suffering. She couldn't confide in anyone. couldn't seek proper medical help, couldn't show a moment of weakness that might be interpreted as unmanly. Every day was a performance, a tightrope walk over a chasm of discovery, and the pain in her leg was a constant reminder of how easily she could fall. Despite the agony, she refused to report to the infirmary. She continued to perform her duties, her face a stoic mask that hid the torment beneath. She participated in drills, stood for long watches in the freezing cold, and went on patrols, her jaw clenched against the pain. This extraordinary display of toughness, which her fellow soldiers saw as admirable grit, was in fact an act of pure desperation. Her uncomplaining nature and obvious intelligence, however, had not gone unnoticed by her superiors. It was clear to them that Private Shurtleff, while a good soldier, was being hampered by a persistent leg injury. Rather than discharge him, a decision was made that would dramatically alter the course of her military career. Her courage and literacy made her a candidate for a different kind of duty. In the spring of 1783, she was reassigned from the dangerous, physically demanding life of a frontline infantryman. She was selected to become an orderly, or aide, to General John Patterson, a respected commander in the Continental Army. This was a role of a personal attendant and scribe, a position of trust, but distinct from the strategic officer role of an aide-de-camp. It removed her from the constant physical misery of marching and fighting, allowing her leg a chance to finally begin to heal, though the bullet remained. Life as an orderly was a world away from the mud and grit of the common soldier's camp. She was now quartered near the general's own lodgings, ate better food, and wore a cleaner, more distinguished uniform. Her duties were now of the mind, not the body. She was responsible for carrying sensitive dispatches, meticulously copying the general's official correspondence, and attending to his personal needs. She excelled in this new position. Her clear handwriting, a skill she had painstakingly acquired in her youth, was a great asset. She was reliable, discreet, and efficient. General Patterson grew to depend on the quiet, serious young soldier who seemed to anticipate his needs and carried out every task with precision. Here, in the nerve center of the Army, Deborah Sampson, the woman from Plimpton, was privy to conversations about troop movements, strategy, and the delicate political negotiations that were bringing the long war to a close. It was an irony of colossal proportions. A woman legally barred from any form of political or military participation was now an invisible witness at its very heart. But the new role brought with it a new set of perils. The physical distance she could maintain as an infantryman was gone. She was now in close daily proximity to the general and his staff of officers. They shared meals, worked in the same cramped headquarters, and sometimes even shared sleeping quarters when traveling. The scrutiny was more intense, the risk of a slip of the tongue or an unguarded moment far greater. There were countless close calls. Once, while helping the general with his coat, he clapped her on the shoulder with such force that it sent a jolt of pain through her still tender wound, and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. Another time, a fellow aide, in a moment of drunken camaraderie, threw an arm around her shoulders and spoke of the sweethearts they had all left behind, asking Robert about his own girl. She had to invent a story of a lost love, a tale of heartbreak that she delivered with a convincing melancholy, a performance that drew on a well of very real loneliness. She learned to navigate this world of masculine intimacy with a dancer's grace. She mastered the art of being present but unobtrusive, of listening more than she spoke, of deflecting personal questions with vague but plausible answers. The general and his staff saw a dedicated, if somewhat shy, young man. They had no reason to suspect that the orderly who brought them their morning tea had a secret that would have scandalized the entire Continental Army. As the war wound down in the summer of 1783, a new and different kind of threat emerged. Peace negotiations were underway in Paris, but the army remained on alert. General Patterson was ordered to Philadelphia to help quell a potential mutiny by disgruntled soldiers who were demanding back pay from a bankrupt Congress. Deborah, as his trusted aide, accompanied him. Philadelphia was a world away from the rustic camps of New York. It was the largest city in America, a bustling, sophisticated metropolis of brick townhouses, cobblestone streets, and the halls of Congress. But for all its civility, the city was a tinderbox. The streets were filled with restless, unpaid soldiers, and the humid summer air was thick with tension and disease. In the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the 18th century city, malignant fevers, likely yellow fever or typhoid, were a constant and deadly threat. It was this invisible enemy, not a British musket ball, that would finally bring down Private Robert Shurtleff. In late June, she fell violently ill. The sickness came on suddenly, a raging fever, uncontrollable chills, and a debilitating weakness that left her unable to stand. Her body, already weakened by years of hardship and a poorly healed wound, had no defense. She tried to hide it at first, as she had hidden everything else, blaming it on a summer cold. But this was no cold. The fever consumed her. She became delirious, her mind a swirl of disjointed memories. The farm in Middleborough, the roar of battle at Tarrytown, the glint of her penknife in the failing light. Her carefully constructed walls of deception crumbled as her consciousness faded. She collapsed in the street and was carried unconscious to a nearby hospital. The hospital was a chaotic, desperate place, filled with the sick and dying. A doctor, a compassionate and skilled physician named Barnabas Binney, was assigned to her case. Seeing the young soldier seemingly on the brink of death, he began his examination. He felt for a pulse, listened to the ragged breathing, and then, to check the severity of the fever, he began to unbutton the soldier's shirt to place a cool compress on his chest. And then he stopped. Underneath the coarse linen shirt and the sweat-soaked uniform, he did not find the hard, flat chest of a man. Instead, he found the linen binder, tightly wound around the soft, unmistakable contours of a woman's breasts. For a moment, Dr. Binney must have been frozen in disbelief. In all his years of practice, in all the horrors of war he had witnessed, he had never encountered anything like this. This brave soldier, this Robert Shurtleff, was a woman. The discovery was staggering, world-altering. His first duty as a physician was to save his patient's life. But what was his duty as an officer and a citizen? The Army regulations were clear. This was a fraud, a crime punishable by dishonorable discharge and public disgrace. But as Dr. Binney looked at the pale, unconscious face of the young woman before him, he saw not a criminal, but a person of incomprehensible courage. He saw the scars of old wounds, the calloused hands of a laborer, and the emaciated frame that spoke of profound hardship. He made a decision, an act of quiet, radical compassion that would change Deborah's life forever. Instead of summoning the military authorities and exposing her on the spot, he chose to protect her. He quietly had her moved from the chaotic public ward. He did not take her to the officers' quarters or the military prison. He took her to his own home. He had his wife and daughters nurse her in the privacy and safety of a private room. He told the Army that Private Shurtleff was under his personal care, a measure not entirely unusual for a soldier of an officer's staff. For days, Deborah drifted in and out of consciousness. her fever breaking under the doctor's attentive care. When she finally awoke, she was not in a noisy, straw-filled hospital bed. She was in a soft, clean bed in a quiet, sunlit room. A kind-faced woman who was not a battlefield nurse was sponging her forehead. For a terrifying moment, she didn't know where she was. Then, the memory flooded back, the fever, the collapse, the hospital, and with it, a cold, sickening dread. She instinctively reached for her chest. The binder was gone. The charade was over. Her secret was out. The life she had built, the identity she had risked everything to maintain for 17 long months, had been stripped away while she lay helpless. Her first emotion was not relief, but pure, unadulterated terror. What would happen to her now? Would she be flogged, imprisoned, sent home in shame? As she lay there, weak and vulnerable, the full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. The brave soldier Robert Shurtleff was gone, and in his place was only Deborah Sampson, the discovered woman, awaiting her punishment. Dr. Barnabas Binney entered the room, his expression a careful mixture of professional concern and gentle humanity. He was not a military officer come to interrogate a prisoner, but a physician attending to his patient. He saw the terror in her wide eyes, the way she clutched the bedsheets as if they were her only anchor in a world that had suddenly capsized. He had anticipated this moment, and he knew his first words would determine everything. He did not address the uniform, the binder, or the soldier named Robert Shurtleff. He addressed the frightened young woman in the bed. "Pray, do not be alarmed," he said, his voice calm and low. "You have been very ill. You are safe here, in my home. My wife and I are taking care of you." His kindness was so unexpected, so contrary to the brutal punishment she had envisioned, that it disarmed her. The terror that had frozen her began to thaw, replaced by a wave of confusion and a fragile, burgeoning hope. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of fear, of relief, of 17 months of pent-up emotion. For the first time since she had walked out of Plimpton as a man, she allowed herself to be vulnerable. In the days that followed, a strange and quiet convalescence began. Dr. Binney, true to his word, protected her secret with absolute discretion. He informed the Army that Private Shurtleff required a lengthy period of recovery under his personal supervision, a story that was accepted without question, given his reputation and the soldier's connection to General Patterson. Within the walls of the Binney home, Deborah was no longer Robert. She was a patient, a guest. Mrs. Binney and her daughters treated her with a tenderness she had not known since she was a small child. They brought her broth, read to her, and provided her with a simple dress to wear. Putting on female clothing for the first time in nearly a year and a half was a profoundly disorienting experience. The fabric felt foreign against her skin, the cut restrictive and strange. For so long, the rough wool of the uniform had been her armor, her identity. This simple dress was a symbol of everything she had shed, everything she had fought to escape. Looking at her reflection, she saw a pale, thin woman with short, boyish hair, a stranger caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. As her physical strength returned, her mind wrestled with the terrifying uncertainty of her future. This peaceful interlude in the Binney household was a temporary sanctuary, a beautiful but fragile bubble. What would happen when she was well enough to leave? Dr. Binney was a kind man, but he was also a man of duty. He could not hide her forever. The Army would demand an accounting for Private Shurtleff. Her conversations with the doctor were cautious at first. He never pressed her, never demanded an explanation. Instead, he asked about her health, about her family, about the books she had read. He treated her as an intelligent and complex individual, not a mere curiosity. This respect more than anything coaxed her story out of her. Hesitantly, she began to speak of her life, of the poverty, the lack of opportunity, the burning desire to be part of something greater than herself. She spoke of her patriotism, her fear, and the incredible loneliness of her deception. Dr. Binney listened without judgment. He was a man of the Enlightenment, a believer in reason and human potential. In Deborah's story, he saw not a crime, but an act of extraordinary will. He saw a person who had defied every limitation society had placed upon her to achieve her goal. His initial compassion deepened into a profound admiration, but the reality of their situation could not be ignored. The war was officially over. In September 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, formally recognizing the United States as an independent nation. The Continental Army was preparing to disband. A final reckoning for Private Robert Shurtleff was inevitable. Dr. Binney knew he had to inform General Patterson. To continue the deception now would be to implicate himself and risk his own career. But how could he reveal the truth without subjecting Deborah to the humiliation of a military tribunal? He pondered the problem for days, seeking a solution that was both honorable and humane. Finally, he devised a plan. He would not send a report through official channels. He would not expose her to a board of inquiry. He would place her fate, in a small but significant way, back into her own hands. One crisp autumn morning, he called her into his study. He looked at her, no longer the emaciated patient, but a strong, recovered young woman, her eyes clear and steady. He handed her a sealed letter. "This is for General Patterson," he said. "It contains a full account of your situation. I believe that when he understands the circumstances, he will act with justice and discretion." He then gave her a sum of money from his own purse to cover her travel expenses. "I want you to deliver this yourself," he continued. "Go to him not as a culprit to be judged, but as a soldier reporting to your commanding officer. Tell him your story. Your service to this country has been real, and it has been honorable. No one can take that away from you." Deborah took the letter, her hand trembling slightly. This piece of paper held her entire future. It could be her death warrant or her salvation. The trust Dr. Binney was placing in her was a heavy burden, but it was also an empowering gift. He was giving her the chance to face her destiny on her own terms. The journey from Philadelphia back to the Army's encampment at West Point was the longest of her life. Dressed once again in her soldier's uniform, a strange and bittersweet reunion with her male persona, she traveled by coach and on foot. With every mile, she replayed the coming confrontation in her mind. She imagined General Patterson's face contorting in anger, his voice booming with accusations of fraud. She pictured herself being stripped of her uniform, drummed out of camp in disgrace, a laughingstock for the very men she had fought alongside. Yet alongside the fear, there was a new and unfamiliar feeling, a sense of defiant pride. She had done it. She had lived as a man, fought as a soldier, and bled for the cause of liberty. She had endured pain and hardship that would have broken many men. Whatever happened now, she had a right to stand tall. The words of Dr. Binney echoed in her mind. Your service has been real. When she finally arrived at West Point, the camp was abuzz with the news of peace and the impending demobilization. Her comrades greeted Robert with slaps on the back, happy to see him recovered from his long illness. Their easy camaraderie was a painful reminder of the life she was about to lose forever. Every friendly face was a potential accuser, every familiar landmark a part of a past she could no longer claim. With the letter feeling like a lead weight in her pocket, she walked to General Patterson's headquarters. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She straightened her uniform, took a deep breath, and requested an audience with the general. She was ushered into his office. General Patterson, a stern but fair man who had always shown her favor, looked up from his papers and smiled. "Shurtleff, it is good to see you back on your feet. Dr. Binney has sent word of your remarkable recovery." "Sir," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, "I have a letter for you from Dr. Binney." She handed him the sealed envelope. The general took it, broke the wax seal, and began to read. Deborah stood at attention, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall behind him, her entire body rigid with tension. She watched as the general's expression shifted. The initial look of pleasant curiosity dissolved into a frown of confusion, which then gave way to wide-eyed, slack-jawed astonishment. He read the letter once, then a second time, as if unable to believe the words on the page. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth. He slowly lowered the letter and looked up at her. He didn't look at her face, but at her whole being. The soldier's posture, the worn uniform, the calloused hands. He was trying to reconcile the loyal, efficient male orderly he had known for months with the impossible story written in the letter. He looked her directly in the eye. His voice was not angry, but quiet, filled with a sense of profound disbelief. Is this true? It was the moment of truth. There was no more hiding, no more deception. "Yes, sir," Deborah replied, her voice clear and unwavering. "It is." General Patterson stared at her for a long moment, then he slowly shook his head, a gesture not of negation but of sheer wonder. He stood up, walked around his desk, and stood before her. The anger she had feared never materialized. Instead, what she saw in his eyes was a complex mixture of shock, bewilderment, and a dawning, grudging respect. He had seen men desert, seen men cower in fear, seen men break under the strain of war, and this woman had endured it all and more. The army he knew had no protocol for this. It was an unprecedented situation, but the war was over, and justice, he decided, demanded a response as unprecedented as the act itself. He would not punish her. He would honor her service. On October 23rd, 1783, Deborah Sampson was given an honorable discharge from the Continental Army. The document, a simple piece of paper, was one of the most remarkable of the entire war. It was signed by General Henry Knox, one of George Washington's most trusted commanders. It certified that Robert Shurtleff had served for the term of 3 years and was honorably discharged from the service of the United States. It was the Army's official, undeniable acknowledgement of her service. They did not erase her. They validated her. With her discharge papers in hand, she walked out of the camp for the last time. She took off the uniform of Robert Shurtleff and put on a dress. The transformation was complete. The great, dangerous, and exhilarating adventure was over. She was Deborah Sampson again. She began the long journey home to Massachusetts, not as the disgraced girl who'd been cast out by her church, but as a veteran of the Revolution. Her war against the British had been won, but she was about to discover that her fight for recognition, for a pension, and for a place in the country she had helped create was just beginning. An honorable discharge was a piece of paper, a validation, a miracle, but it was not a map. As Deborah Sampson journeyed north from West Point back towards the small towns of Massachusetts that had defined and confined her early life, she was navigating a territory more uncertain than any battlefield. She had left as a runaway, an excommunicated pariah in the eyes of her church, a girl who had dared to put on men's clothes. She was returning as a veteran, a woman who had lived a life that no one, least of all the people of her hometown, could possibly comprehend. The uniform of Robert Shurtleff was packed away, a relic of a life that felt both like a dream and like the only real thing she had ever done. In its place was a simple dress, likely provided by the kindness of the Binneys. The fabric felt alien, the posture it demanded restrictive. After 17 months of striding with a soldier's gait, of standing at attention with her shoulders squared, the simple act of walking like a woman felt like a performance, a new and far more awkward disguise than the one she had just shed. Her return was not to Plimpton, the town of her birth, but to the nearby town of Sharon, where some of her relatives lived. The news of her arrival would have spread like wildfire through the tight-knit communities. She was no longer just Deborah Sampson, the poor girl bound out to the Thomas farm. She was a curiosity, a scandal, a local legend whispered about over fences and in church pews. The story was simply too fantastical to be believed, and yet there she was, the living proof of it. Imagine the first encounters, the shock on the faces of relatives who had last seen a tall, strong-willed but conventional young woman. Now they were faced with someone who had a different look in her eye, a way of holding herself that was not like other women. Her hair was still cropped short. Her hands bore the calluses of a musket, not a spinning wheel, and she walked with a slight but permanent limp, a souvenir from a British musket ball. How do you explain a life like that? How do you bridge the chasm between their world of harvests, sermons, and quilting bees, and her world of sentry duty, musket fire, and the constant gnawing fear of discovery? The questions must have been endless, a mix of morbid curiosity and genuine bewilderment. They would have asked about the battles, but they couldn't possibly understand the true fight, the daily, hourly battle to maintain her identity, to hide her body, to suppress her own nature. She was a ghost from a world they could not see, and her presence was a disruption to the natural order of their lives. She tried to reintegrate, to pick up the threads of a life she had abandoned. She was, after all, a woman in her early 20s, and the prescribed path was clear: marriage and motherhood. But how could she? The freedoms she had experienced, however terrifying, had changed her irrevocably. She had known the camaraderie of the barracks, the purpose of a military campaign, the agency of moving through the world as a man, unencumbered by the expectations placed on her sex. To return to the domestic sphere felt like being placed in a cage, a comfortable and socially acceptable cage, but a cage nonetheless. The world she was expected to inhabit now seemed impossibly small. The psychological toll of this transition was immense. In the Army, her days were structured by duty and command. In civilian life, they were structured by the repetitive, often isolating tasks of a woman's work. She likely suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress. The sounds of a backfiring cart might have sent her diving for cover. The sight of a red coat could have triggered a jolt of pure adrenaline. And in the quiet of the night, the ghosts of the battlefield and the even more persistent ghost of Robert Shurtleff must have been her constant companions. In 1785, about 2 years after her discharge, she did what was expected of her. She married Benjamin Gannett, a farmer from Sharon. On the surface, it was a conventional match, but for Deborah, it was a profound compromise. We know very little about the personal dynamics of their relationship, but one can only imagine the complexities. Did she tell him her full story before they married? Or did the truth emerge slowly, piece by piece? Benjamin Gannett was, by all accounts, a simple, hard-working man. He was now married to a woman who had seen and done things he could never imagine. She knew how to load and fire a musket with deadly efficiency. She understood military strategy. She had lived a life of radical independence. How did this extraordinary past fit into the mundane realities of running a farm and raising children? They were the parents of 4 children: Earl, born 1786, Mary, Polly, born 1788, Patience, born 1790, and Susanna Baker Shepherd, whom they adopted after she was orphaned. Deborah became a wife and a mother, but the soldier within her never truly went away. The physical reminders of her service were inescapable. The musket ball remained lodged in her leg, a source of chronic, debilitating pain. As she grew older, the limp worsened. Some days the pain was so severe she could barely walk. It affected her ability to do the demanding physical labor required of a farmer's wife. It was a constant internal echo of the war, a physical manifestation of the secret she had carried for so long. And then there was the question of money. The Gannett farm was a hard-scrabble existence. They were perpetually poor, struggling to make ends meet. This financial hardship brought another aspect of her past life to the forefront: the promise of a military pension. The new United States government was, to put it mildly, broke. It owed vast sums of money to its soldiers, but its treasury was empty. Thousands of veterans, men who had lost limbs and livelihoods for the cause of independence, were living in poverty, petitioning a seemingly deaf government for the pay they were promised. For these men, the process was a bureaucratic nightmare. For Deborah Sampson, it was a near impossibility. Her fight for a pension became her second war, a campaign waged not with a musket, but with petitions and letters, fought not on the fields of New York, but in the dusty halls of the Massachusetts State House and the United States Congress. Her first petition, filed in 1792, was for back pay that was still owed to her. The state of Massachusetts, after much debate, eventually recognized the validity of her claim. They acknowledged that Robert Shurtleff had served, that his record was honorable, and they awarded her the sum of £34. The wording of the legislative resolution was extraordinary. It stated that the treasurer was directed to pay the sum to Deborah Gannett in recognition of the fact that she did actually perform the duty of a soldier. It was a small victory, but a monumental one. A government body had officially acknowledged a woman's military service. But back pay was one thing. A pension for her injuries was another. A pension was a regular payment, a lifeline for a disabled veteran. To get one, she had to prove not only that she had served, but that she had been wounded in the line of duty and was now disabled as a result. Her case was utterly unprecedented. There was no box to check for a female soldier. The entire system was built on the assumption that soldiers were men. For years, her petitions were ignored or denied. She was a legal and bureaucratic anomaly. How could they grant a pension to a woman when women were not supposed to be soldiers in the first place? To do so would be to admit that the system had been fooled, that the rigid gender roles of their society were, in fact, permeable. It was a truth many were not ready to accept. It was during this long, frustrating struggle that her story found a champion in one of the most famous figures of the American Revolution, Paul Revere. By the early 1800s, Revere was an elder statesman in Boston, a respected silversmith and industrialist. He heard of Deborah's case, of her poverty and her persistent pain. Intrigued, he met with her, listened to her story, and was profoundly moved by her courage and her plight. In 1804, Revere wrote a letter to a Massachusetts congressman on her behalf, a letter that still exists today and serves as a powerful testament to Deborah's character. He wrote, "I have been induced to inquire her situation and character since she quit the male habit and soldier's uniform for the more decent apparel of her own gender. I can aver that I have been conversant with her for many years, and I have never heard her character called in question, but all have spoken of her as a woman of handsome talents, good morals, a dutiful wife, and an affectionate parent." He then addressed her military service directly. She is now much out of health. She has several children. Her husband is a good sort of man, though of small force in business. They have a few acres of poor land which they cultivate, but they are really poor. She has told me that she has no doubt that her ill health is in consequence of her being exposed when she did a soldier's duty, and that she would be glad to receive a pension from the government. Revere's endorsement was a turning point. He was not just a celebrity. He was a man of unimpeachable patriotic credentials. His word carried immense weight. He was essentially telling the government, this is not a fraud or a fantasy. This is a real soldier, a real hero, and we owe her. Finally, in 1805, after 13 years of petitions, Congress approved her request. Deborah Sampson was placed on the United States pension roll as a disabled soldier. She was awarded a pension of $4 a month. It was a meager sum, even for the time, but its symbolic value was immeasurable. The federal government of the nation she had fought to create had officially recognized her as one of its own soldiers. Around this same time, another event occurred that would catapult her from a local curiosity into a figure of national renown. A local writer and publisher named Herman Mann heard her story and saw its commercial potential. In 1797, he published a book titled The Female Review, or Memoirs of an American Young Lady. It was a biography of Deborah's life, and it was an instant sensation. But this book presents one of the greatest controversies of Deborah's story. It was not a straightforward factual account. Mann took her incredible life and embellished it for popular appeal. He filtered her raw, gritty experience through the sentimental, romantic lens of 18th century literature. He invented a tragic love affair to explain her decision to enlist. He described her as a delicate, blushing maiden, even as he recounted her battlefield exploits. He turned her into a literary heroine, a character that fit the public's expectations of what a woman, even a cross-dressing one, should be. For example, Mann's book includes a scene where Robert Shurtleff develops a romantic attachment to a beautiful young heiress in Philadelphia, a relationship that causes our hero great internal turmoil. There is no historical evidence that any such thing ever happened. It was a fictional subplot designed to add spice and romance to the narrative. The real story of poverty, of a desperate need for agency, of a raw and unglamorous patriotism was apparently not enough. This raises a difficult question. How much of the book is true? While the basic outline of her service is accurate, many of the details, the dialogue, and the internal monologues are almost certainly the product of Mann's literary imagination. For Deborah, this must have been a deeply strange experience. She had become famous, but the person the public was reading about was not quite her. It was a fictionalized, romanticized version of herself. She had spent 17 months performing the role of a man. Now she was forced to watch as a man's interpretation of her life became her public identity. She had become a character in the story of her own life, and the author was not her. The publication of the Female Review thrust Deborah Sampson into a strange new spotlight. She was no longer just a local curiosity. She was a national celebrity, a heroine of a sensationalized bestseller. But fame, as she quickly discovered, does not pay the bills. The Gannett farm remained a place of constant grinding labor. The $4 a month pension was a help, but it was not enough to lift her family from the grip of poverty. And the book, while it made her name known, primarily enriched its author, Herman Mann. Deborah was faced with a modern dilemma. She had a famous brand, but she wasn't monetizing it. So, with a boldness that mirrored her original decision to enlist, she decided to take her story on the road. If the public was so fascinated by the tale of the female soldier, she would tell it to them herself, for a price. In 1802, she embarked on what was, for the time, an extraordinary venture for a woman. a public speaking tour. This was not a common or respectable thing for a woman to do. The public sphere belonged to men. For a woman, a wife and mother, to travel from town to town, to stand on a stage before crowds of strangers and speak of her life, was an act of profound defiance. It was, in its own way, as radical as putting on the uniform in the first place. Imagine the scene. A dusty town hall, or a simple meeting house in Massachusetts or New York. The room is packed with curious onlookers who have paid their admission fee to see the famous female soldier. The air is thick with anticipation. First, Deborah would appear on stage in conventional women's clothing. She was now in her 40s, a wife and mother, and she looked the part. She would then deliver a speech, a carefully prepared oration that was likely polished, if not outright written, by Hermann Mann. The speech was a masterpiece of 18th century rhetoric. It was patriotic, sentimental, and carefully crafted to appeal to the sensibilities of the era. It spoke of her love for her country, her youthful zeal, and the hardships of war. But it also subtly justified her actions within the acceptable framework of female virtue. She presented her decision to enlist not as an act of rebellion against her gender, but as an overflow of patriotic fervor that simply could not be contained by a woman's frail form. It was a performance of her public persona, the romanticized heroine of the female review. But then came the grand finale. After finishing her speech, she would excuse herself from the stage, leaving the audience buzzing. A few moments later, the doors would open again, and the person who walked back onto the stage was not Deborah Gannett, the farmer's wife. It was Private Robert Shurtleff. She would reappear dressed in the full, authentic military uniform of a soldier of the Continental Army. The blue wool coat with its white facings, the tricorn hat, the white breeches and stockings. And she carried a musket. The transformation was stunning, a visual shock that went straight to the heart of every social convention of the time. The sight of a middle-aged woman, a mother, transformed into a soldier before their very eyes must have been electrifying. And then she would begin the drill. With sharp, precise movements, she would perform the manual exercise of arms, the complex 27-step series of motions required to load, aim, and fire a 5-foot-long, 10-pound musket. Present arms. Make ready. Take aim. Fire. Her voice, ringing with military command, would echo through the silent hall. Her movements, honed by months of relentless drilling at West Point, were flawless. This was not a dainty imitation. This was the real thing. This was the muscle memory of war, performed by a body that had lived it. This part of the performance was her irrefutable truth. The speech may have been Mann's words, the story in the book embellished. But the way she held the musket, the efficiency of her movements, the unyielding authority in her posture, that was hers alone. It was the ultimate validation of her story, a visceral demonstration that silenced any doubters. She wasn't just telling a story, she was reenacting her own life, proving her legitimacy in the most dramatic way possible. The tour was grueling. Travel was arduous and expensive. Sometimes the crowds were large and appreciative. Other times she performed to a near-empty hall, barely covering her costs. She was away from her husband and children for long stretches, a lonely traveler reliving the most intense period of her life, night after night, for the entertainment of strangers. The physical toll was also significant. Performing the strenuous military drill with the chronic pain in her leg must have been an act of pure will, but for a time it provided a vital income for her family and allowed her a measure of control over her own narrative. As the years passed, however, the fame from the book and the tour began to fade. The nation was moving on and the heroes of the revolution were aging. Deborah's financial struggles continued. In 1818, the United States Congress passed a new pension act, this one designed to provide for all veterans of the Continental Army who could prove they were in financial need. This offered a new glimmer of hope. Her previous pension had been for her disability. This new act was for her service. Once again, she entered the bureaucratic fray. The process was even more invasive and humiliating than before. To qualify, she had to submit a detailed inventory of all her worldly possessions to a court to prove her poverty. This document, which still survives, is a heartbreaking snapshot of her life. The Gannett family's total assets were valued at just over $350. The list includes their 10-acre farm with its old and much out-of-repair buildings. It lists 1 cow, 6 sheep, 1 pig. It details their meager household goods, 6 chairs, 1 table, a few old knives and forks, 6 plates, and some old ironware. It is the stark, unromantic reality behind the legend. After another lengthy process of review and verification in 1821, she was finally approved. She was granted a new pension of $8 a month for the rest of her life. It was another victory, another hard-won acknowledgement from the country she had served. Deborah Sampson Gannett lived out her final years on the farm in Sharon. The quiet, domestic life she had once rebelled against became her final reality. She was a mother, a grandmother, a wife, but she was always also a soldier. The pain in her leg was a constant companion, a physical link to Robert Shurtleff. She died on April 29, 1827, at the age of 66. The musket ball was still lodged in her body. But her story, and its power to challenge the system, did not end with her death. Her husband, Benjamin, was left elderly and infirm, and he had come to depend on her pension for his survival. A year after her death, he did something utterly unthinkable. He petitioned Congress for a widower's pension. He argued that since his wife had been the veteran, he, as her surviving spouse, should be entitled to her benefits. This was a legal and social bombshell. The entire concept of a military pension was built around a male soldier providing for his dependent female widow. The idea of a man claiming dependency on his wife's military service turned the entire patriarchal system on its head. The petition was, of course, initially rejected. There was no law, no precedent for such a thing. But Benjamin, perhaps having learned a thing or two about persistence from his late wife, did not give up. For 10 years, he and his children continued to petition. Finally, in 1837, the case reached a congressional committee. The committee members were stumped. They acknowledged that the case was new and novel. There was no law that applied. But then, in a remarkable moment of insight and justice, the committee issued a report that stated while there was no specific statute, the reason of the thing applied. They argued that the spirit of the pension laws was to support the surviving spouses of those who had served, and if the soldier happened to be a woman, her husband's claim was just as valid. In 1838, a special act of Congress was passed granting Benjamin Gannett a pension, but he died before receiving it. It was her ultimate triumph, posthumously. Her life was so extraordinary that it forced the United States government to change and eventually rewrite its own rules, creating a new category of existence, military widow, to match the sheer force of her unique and revolutionary life. Deborah Sampson's story is not just a curious footnote in American history. It's a profound testament to the human spirit's refusal to be defined by society's limitations. She was not a general or a strategist. She was an ordinary woman born into extraordinary times who chose an extraordinary path. She fought in 2 wars, the first for her country's independence with a musket in her hand, the second for her own recognition and survival with a pen and a tireless, unyielding will. She was a woman who had to become a man to claim the right to fight for freedom, only to discover that her greatest battle would be as a woman fighting for the acknowledgement of that service. Her life exposes the stark contradictions of a nation founded on the principle of liberty, yet which denied it to so many. She reminds us that patriotism and courage have no gender, and that the story of America is written not just by the famous men in the history books, but by the forgotten soldiers, the silent sufferers, and the defiant women who refused to accept the world as it was, and in doing so, helped create the world as it could be. Her legacy is a quiet but powerful challenge, asking us to look deeper, to question our assumptions, and to find the hero in the most unexpected of places.